there's always a preamble to the amble, or at least there should be. So the story always begins before you start telling it. You kind of jump in the middle of the river and pretend it's the source, So in this case, I think, I can get to the apprenticeship in a second, but to be fair to all of us, I'm fairly sure I don't have any direct corroboration on the matter because everybody who was there at the time is dead now, but I think probably from the womb, I was read to. I certainly was read to from a very, very young age, on this side of the threshold. And that's had an immense consequence. I remember, for example, my mother bringing me to a drive-in movie back in the day, drive-in movies. And it was Gone with the Wind, which was friggin' long by any estimation. And I would have been 6, maybe, something like this. And of course, she's counting on being able to watch a movie because I'm conked out in the seat beside her. And as she told the story to me many years later, I was, my chin on the dashboard there, watched the whole thing without even blinking. And it was long and it was taxing and all the rest. I figure, if that's a true story, I think it was. I have a vague memory of it. It comes from what she did, 4 or 5 years before that. And there's something, I'm not saying I remember any of the stories she told, of course I don't. But I remember 2 things. I remember something about her telling them. And I remember there's a certain cadence that people begin to adopt when they're storytelling. It's not information. And God knows it's not argument. It's not philosophizing. It's not hypothesizing. It's not arguing. There's something else, it's everything about it is different. Probably the set of the jaw is different when you're doing it. Certainly your solar plexus is different. Your breathing patterns are different. And that's what she did. And she must have done it for years and years. So that has stayed with me as a kind of imprint to the point where I think the way the world comes at me is it's telling itself. And in that sense, maybe my take on the fundaments of life might be a little different in the sense that they're very old. Not old in my own lifetime old, but old, generationally, ancestrally old. I think I've been exposed to a kind of way of being human that's so fundamentally out of fashion now that it's not clear that it's coming back, certainly not in my lifetime. Because storytelling takes a certain degree of patience on the hearing end, number one. And number two, the best storytellers begin with something like this. I don't know anything, but I heard this once. Or you start telling a story very badly, and then the gifted storyteller can't stand it anymore, and finally will gently or otherwise introduce him or herself into the proceedings to get the story more faithfully told, you could say. And in which case, the people who are telling the story badly look at each other very conspiratorially and give themselves the thumbs up because they got the old person rolling, you see. So that's the preamble. That's the way life sounds to me. It sounds like a horse with 4 hooves, rolling over itself and then landing, but asymmetrically. And then years go by. I'm accepted to Harvard Divinity School, which is just a laughable arrangement because the marks weren't the best coming out of university. And then I didn't have the money, but somehow they gave me a scholarship. And then I thought I wanted to go into priesthood. But I'd never been to church in my life. And so I actually literally did not know what I was talking about. So when they came for the kind of screening interviews, to determine the suitability of your vocation, because it's a big deal, right? You're going to be a proto-priest by the time you're done here in 2 years' time. And I didn't survive the first 3 questions of the interview because I didn't have a sponsoring congregation. I still remember it. I didn't have a denominational affiliation, didn't have a sponsoring congregation, and I'd never been to church. The guy just looked at me and he said, "What are you doing here?" And I said to him, I reiterated, I said, "Oh, I wanted to be go into the clergy in some fashion. He said, you want to go into the priesthood of something or other, he said. I said, yeah, that's about it. And so anyway, needless to say, they didn't take me. So I ended up in the academic side of the study, not the devotional side, which turned out to suit me very, very well indeed, and spared a lot of church types a lot of trouble in having to deal with me. And in the same week that happened at Harvard Divinity School in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I went to one of those meet the faculty events that kick off the year in the fall. And somebody came over to me and said, you got to come and meet this guy. And already I'm a little disillusioned, disenchanted, it's not working out. I'm far from home and so on. And there's this tall, lanky black man of indeterminate age. It's clear he wasn't 40, but he could have been 90, somewheres in between. And he was phosphorescent. That's the best way to describe him. He was beyond electric. He was crackling with a kind of dynamism and lack of jitteriness about what he was doing in this world. And I'd never seen the likes of it in a human form in my life. I didn't know such a thing existed. And he was just talking. But the manner of his presence was, he wouldn't appreciate this, but he's dead now, so he can't correct me. It was a biblical kind of moment. The kind of thing you think, if it ever existed, was so long ago, it couldn't possibly exist now. And there it was, right in front of me. And I was probably like everybody else there. I was just what they call gate mouthed, just your jaw swinging on a hinge. You don't know what to say. And at some point he looked at me and he said, you should come to my class. By this time I realized that he was in the devotional side of things, right? In the what they call the hortatory arts, the arts of argument and preaching and so forth. I said, well, they counseled me out of this already, so I don't qualify. He leaned over and he said, son, I'm the teacher. If I tell you you're qualified, Harvard Divinity School or otherwise, you are qualified, he said. So I'm thinking, man, and he turns the place upside down to boot. So anyway, I went to the first meeting. I wasn't supposed to go, but I did. And I don't know what possessed me, but on the way out on the dresser, there was a few harmonicas that I had with me. And I picked up one and put it in my pocket. I have no idea why to this day. I walked in to the chapel of the Divinity School, which is where his classroom was. He was already in full flight. He was, quote, storytelling. And, I'm a very shy person. And I don't know why I took that harmonica out of my pocket, but I did. And to the best of my abilities, which were meager at the time, I attempted to accompany him or echo him or in some other fashion, augment what he was doing. And I don't know how much kind of spicy language we can get away with here, but I'll tell you, he looked at me in mid-flight, didn't even break a beat, didn't break a sweat, nothing. But he looked at me, and his look said two things at the same time. First one was, who the you think you are? That was the first one. And the second is if you got the stones to do this, you better not stop now. So he was in a strange way daring me to continue. That was the very first encounter. He called me midweek, his wife did, asked me if I wanted to do a church service with him. Now, don't forget, I'd never been to church. So for me, church services are like hallowed things, So you don't mess with it, and you certainly don't do it as an outsider. But, and that's what I said. She said, no, he's very persuaded that, that you can do it. I said, well, so what should I bring? Oh, just bring what you brought. A harmonica in a church. She said, absolutely, yeah. I said, is there anything I should read? Is there anything I should know? She said, just a sec. And she was off talking to him. She come back and she said, Blue says to read the Good Samaritan. So apparently I was going to do the Good Samaritan on a harmonica in a church in Danvers, Massachusetts. And that's how this aspect of my life probably started. So uncertain and just literally, as I said, almost biblically, just plucked from my ordinary life and placed here beside him and dared to proceed. It's not a bad beginning. That was the very big early days of what turned into an undeclared apprenticeship with somebody who was the master of the masters of the art. And so I sit here today in Boise, Idaho, in a bad hotel, talking to you about it. It directly comes from those days.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think you said Blue. So was this Brother Blue? Was
Yes,
this?
sir.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know how I ran across his stuff, but I've been reading a little bit about him, and yeah, I think I put the two and two together. I know on one of your albums, there's also a song that's called Harvard Square.
That's right.
That's where he used to perform, and I was actually just reading a whole thing about him on the Harvard Square website. That they were like honoring him. He would always perform there, and yeah, that's quite remarkable. That you got to meet somebody like that, and it definitely something translated because you are a very prolific storyteller, and it almost seems like you have an endless amount of stories, and you have a story for any occasion, any and every occasion. And
his the consequence of meeting somebody like this is that they steal a lot of things from you. Now, it doesn't seem that way at the time, but I came to realize that, I was fairly young in my understanding of life at the time. And my characterization of it is that I was slouching on the threshold of personhood or adulthood anyway, and no inclination to walk through the door. I mean, it's not uncommon for people of my age at the time, and it's not uncommon today either. And this guy came along, and what he stole from me was my ability to slouch there and gripe and complain and moan because, quote, I'd never seen the real thing. See, so I had no reason to try to outgrow my life up until that time because I had no example. So I had all the excuses. I'm not saying I said any of this stuff out loud to myself, but I realized that certainly was the posture that I had taken. And then I met the real thing. And then all my excuses were gone, you see. And it didn't turn me into a better person. Certainly not. But it did dare me to, minus any kind of formal initiation as being 13 or 15 or whatever it was. Minus that, he kind of took me aside. And for the next 7 years, he saw to it that everything that he was capable of somehow flashed by me. He didn't keep anything to himself, really. But there was no instruction. I should really say that. I mean, there was performance, and then there was the time in between the performance, and there was traveling to the gigs. And I traveled with him and his wife quite a bit, Ruth, who's still alive, and she's still working, I believe, with Radcliffe College down there. And it was just a wondrous thing, and it's if I ever run out of gratitude because I'm dispirited or dissatisfied at some point in my life, and I have the good sense just to try to remember things, then those 7 years off and on are reason enough for me to outgrow whatever melancholy has come to catch me. Even at the age of 68, which I am now, I'm still an apprentice to that experience and that example.
yeah, what strikes me is there's a couple of things you said, but you said the real thing, and then how that kind of impacted you into like growing up. So I'm wondering what you mean by the real thing.
Mm. Well, the real thing is not always good in the sense of encouraging or friendly or easy on you. Quite the contrary. The real thing comes from somewhere, and it's a learning devoted event, meeting the real thing. It's not a knowledge-based thing. It's a learning-based thing. Learning's insanely expensive, because you start learning stuff about what you think you know, and pretty soon most of what you know doesn't survive. And you're a young person besides, you're in another country. You're at Harvard, you're supposed to be relatively smart, right, to get in the first place. And here's this guy who doesn't say anything to you. basically doesn't say anything to you. And his authenticity was blistering at times because he was never off. There was no performance blue and then street corner blue and then, at home with a cup of tea blue. I mean, if there was anyone around, he was that guy. And if there's nobody around but him and his almighty and his ancestry, he was that guy. We should also mention he was a black man, and he came to age, in your country in a rather challenging time, right? It's not for me to describe it in any kind of detail, but he had his luminaries, he had his heroes, and Malcolm X was one of them. He'd often talk about him. And Miles Davis was another one. He'd often talk about him. And frankly, anybody who stuck it to the system was his guy, And this were radicalizing times. So it was dangerous, obviously, to be a young black man in those days. And it may be no less dangerous now, I don't know. But I used to travel with him to places I would never have survived going to if I wasn't with him. And we would travel places that he would never have survived in if he had not been with me. It was a stunning thing that, I knew I was with somebody who could, after his fashion, change the world. I don't mean at some huge scale, but locally speaking, he could literally change how things went by his consequence. And this generated an enormous amount of hostility in certain places to go along with the awe that people like me had. Yeah. So this is what I mean by biblical. In the same moment, there were people who wanted to conceive babies with him and people who wanted to murder him in the same moment. If that's not real, I don't know what real is.
Yeah. Getting that sense of authenticity and also that sense of intensity that comes along with it. We're not used to that. Somebody always being just in that kind of space, not pretending to be somebody, not putting on a mask to match the personality in front of them.
Mm-mm. No, he would, this guy could inhale the energy in the room, and he got to the point where, he would understand if I said this, that you would, after a fashion, you'd hate the guy. Why? Because his example was so capable that your example looked very paltry by comparison. So even though he did nothing to warrant these mixed feelings that you'd have about him, you had them nonetheless, right? Because you could never look adequate or achieved around him because his standard for being a human being was so remarkably high and demanding. But he never held you to it. I should say it again. This is all coming from me, what you're hearing, no? He didn't impose any of this stuff. He was just like a mountain, right? And if you feel intimidated by the mountain, it's not the mountain's fault.